My Ko-Fi supporters see my videos early. The link is in the description or on my channel if you want to support me. Nullius is one of the more conceptually interesting mods for Factorio. You play as a von Neumann probe, designed to travel to a lifeless planet and seed life upon it, before creating copies of yourself to send to new barren planets. It seats itself as an almost prequel to Factorio, as you seed the grass, trees and biters which in a million years an unfortunate crash-landed engineer may end up fighting. The first order of business is to begin salvaging our own crash site for basic buildings. To begin in Nullius, you have nothing at all, literally zero crafting recipes, and to begin research you need to work with what you were already given. Among the ruins were some basic power infrastructure, so I get started placing down the solar panels and accumulators. We are given very few, and it will be a long time before we can build any more, although we do have a couple broken ones we can fix up to last us until we can research our own power generation. I said lifeless planet earlier, and I mean it. This planet has no life and never has, meaning no trees or coal or oil, nor even oxygen in the atmosphere. Our very first research requires no science packs, just a powered lab, and gives us mineral samples, the first step to understanding this planet on which we have found ourselves. Mineral samples require 3 raw resources found scattered on the surface of the planet: iron ore, sandstone, and bauxite. As it turns out, this planet only has 5 major resources, being the 3 just mentioned, as well as limestone and volcanic gases from the occasional fumarole. You might notice these little Spidertron head things floating around me, and they are companion drones included as part of the Nullius Maximus Modpack, which is what I am running. There are 3 main Nullius modpacks made by the Nullius developer: Nullius, Nullius Momenti, and Nullius Maximus, each adding mods on top of the previous. I went with this one because it sounded most fun, but it does add a lot of technologies into the game, all of which usually need to be researched to move on to the next set, so it might not be everyone's choice. In the background here, I just properly automated mineral samples. So we've found out what's in the ground, but what about the air and the water? Well, that's what climate samples are here to tell us, which are made by combining air and seawater. As it turns out, the air is mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide, which for a lifeless planet one would expect to be about right. It does however mean no open air combustion, meaning that if we need to burn anything, we have to get our oxygen from an alternative source. Like I was talking about earlier, some of the buildings we were given from the crash site are broken and require fixing with some materials to use, such as these solar panels which we can fix with sand. Now, our first step is going to be to automate plastic, which is the first of the super complex crafting chains. I put together a little visualization to help make sense of this crafting chain whilst I build it. At the centre of the process is saline water electrolysis, which takes in saline water and zaps it into hydrogen, oxygen, chlorine and sodium hydroxide. To get saline water, we separate seawater into it, as well as a byproduct of wastewater, which we can simply void back into the nearest body of water. Next up, we take in air from the atmosphere and separate it into carbon dioxide and nitrogen, of which we only want the carbon dioxide, so we void off all of the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. We can combine the carbon dioxide and some hydrogen into methane, which also produces a byproduct of pure water. This methane can be combined with oxygen to make ethylene, which again produces a byproduct of pure water. Finally, the ethylene gets combined with chlorine, which gives us PVC, our first, and very poor, way of producing plastic, which creates a byproduct of hydrogen chloride. Of course, it couldn't be that simple. You see, this process is producing an excess of oxygen, water, chlorine and hydrogen chloride. The oxygen and water are fine, as we can void the excess using an overflow valve, but chlorine and hydrogen chloride would both be harmful to the life we are here to create if we were to void them, so we need to turn them into a less toxic chemical before we can get rid of them, the technology to do which we don't quite have access to yet. In the meantime, there is another resource we want, which also uses a lot of the same chemicals we're already producing, which is graphite. To create graphite, we take some of the carbon dioxide and hydrogen and combine it into carbon monoxide, which yet again creates pure water as a byproduct. Then, by combining carbon monoxide with more hydrogen, you get graphite and pure water. Now, if I went into every crafting chain in this much detail, I would probably be here all week, but I thought it was important to set the tone for quite how complex a mod this is, and give you a taste of the kind of thing I was putting up with for every recipe. We finally have access to a new source of power, wind power. It is just how you expect it to be, unreliable, but without any maintenance needed, the very definition of set and forget. Now, to get wind turbines, I had to start on our new science pack, mechanical prototypes. The recipe is simple, just 3 gears and a motor, which take an assortment of iron intermediates and plastic, and aren't all that interesting really. You might notice that the focus is taken a bit off the assembly machines in this mod, as the majority of metal intermediates are made in these foundry buildings. Now, wind turbines have this thing called airspace, which essentially means you can't place a wind turbine too close to another, so they're going to have to be spread out all across the factory, rather than squished into one place like solar panels can be. I get a couple more researches done so I can build my own miners and get to work on a smelting stack. Producing iron like this creates a lot of gravel as a byproduct. It doesn't actually give you that much iron for the amount of ore you put in, but we're going to get better ways to produce iron later, so this will do for now. But with an iron stack set up, we can finally begin to automate the iron components and cut down on our handcrafting times significantly. In most mods it is wise to build a mall ASAP, but with all of the intermediates and complex crafting chains in Nullius, it seems wise to just automate all of the common intermediates and handcraft your way through to bots and provider chests, which come relatively early in the game. Talking about bots, these companion drones are kind of insane, and I don't see why I would ever need to upgrade to actual bots. If they weren't included in the mod pack, I definitely would not have included them by choice, but it's the mod author's choice, so I'm not going to hook a gift horse in the mouth. Because of the previously mentioned inefficiency of the iron ore recipe, I get even more furnaces placed down. It's worth mentioning that despite looking like the vanilla burner furnaces, they are in fact electric, due to the fact that this planet has literally 0 fossil fuels on it, meaning anything combustible we would have to make ourselves. This base isn't going to power itself, so I get started on the beginning of what is going to become a very extensive wind farm. You might have noticed that I use a cliff explosive here. The game gives you like 30 to begin with, but you don't get any more for like 20 hours, so they should be used wisely, not just to make a wind farm a little bit neater like I did. Back at the knot of chemistry, I set up filters which use graphite, iron, plastic and carbon dioxide, and have an important ingredient in a lot of chemistry related buildings such as chemical plants, seawater intakes and others. I also begin automating pipes so that we don't need to rely on only the few scavenged from the crash. We can't quite automate underground pipes yet however, as for some reason it needs sand, which we don't quite have automated yet. Sometimes the weird ingredients for buildings make sense, like electric poles in an electrolyzer, and sometimes it's sand for reasons. Wind turbines give us a way to generate power, but we won't reach accumulators for a long time, not even in this video, so we need an alternative way to store power for when the wind turbine output is low. An option that Nullius gives us is to use a surge electrolyzer, which only turns on when there is a surplus of power, and then recombine the hydrogen and oxygen in a combustion chamber to get steam, which we can store as essentially a power battery. The mod also gives us 3 different types of turbine, which we can swap between using the home button: backup, standard and exhaust. Standard turbines work like in the vanilla game. Backup turbines only turn on when accumulators would, and exhaust turbines run constantly, regardless of whether there is power demand. Due to us only having wind and solar power, backup turbines in standard will do the same thing, but later on when we get some active power generation, I'll change these turbines to backup. There are 2 things worth highlighting here. Firstly, this is in no way energy generation. For every megajoule of energy put into those electrolyzers, only 850 kilojoules come out of the turbines. It is energy storage, and not very good storage at that. Secondly, we are now using pure water electrolysis rather than saline water, so we don't need to worry about the chlorine and sodium hydroxide byproducts. However, we do need to purify the water prior to inputting it. When it came to actually connecting the thing, I found that I hadn't even researched seawater intakes yet, and I had gone through all of the ones from the crash site, so I had to quickly go and research it first. As you can see, I did build this with tileability in mind. The idea that if I ever needed more energy storage, I could just copy this over to the right ad infinitum. However, I never end up needing another one. You might remember the pure water byproduct from the plastic build. Well, with our ability to now electrolyse pure water, I can turn it into oxygen and hydrogen and feed it back into the system. My goal now is to scale up into a proper starter base, starting by building a bigger saline electrolysis plant. Yet again, I build it with tileability in mind, and yet again, I never make another one of these. I eventually get tired of handcrafting underground pipes, and decide to get them automated, which begins by crushing sandstone into sand and stone. All the stone I turn into bricks for building and paving, and the sand of course goes over to the pipe foundry. Notice the use of Bob's inserters here, which is included as part of the Modpack. Finally now, I can get around to finishing the saline electrolysis setup. You can see at the top, I fiddle around with the pipes to make them work with a tileable design. My immediate next step is to get to work on a setup to void all of the useless chlorine and sodium hydroxide. That's right, useless chlorine, because we've researched a much better plastic recipe which doesn't need it, leaving chlorine entirely useless for the moment. I set up a caustic solution which is made by combining sodium hydroxide and saline water and can be voided, giving us an effective way to get rid of one of our byproducts, but chlorine is still a problem. Naturally, it's a problem which we ignore for now, instead setting up pure water electrolysis to handle any pure water byproducts we produce later on. I include these top-up valves on the pipe, which means that pure water electrolysis outputs will be prioritised over the saline water electrolysis. Or it should mean that, but due to how low pressure these crappy tier 1 pipes are, the output of a valve can never actually reach a high enough pressure for it to stop trying to fill. I get carbon dioxide set up. Now to understand why I have pumps running into my tanks, you have to understand how pipes work in this mod. Every fluid structure, pipes and tanks has a maximum pressure, so if I have these tier 1 pipes with a maximum pressure of 40%, but then the tank has a maximum pressure of 85%, then the tank will never fill entirely, because the pressure inside can only reach 40%. A pump can pressurise the structure in front of it to any pressure, meaning that even though the incoming pipes only have 40% pressure, the pump can get the tank up to its maximum of 85%. This sounds boring and stupid, but it is important when deciding which fluid production takes priority. For instance, an overflow valve only lets things through if its inputs are above 75% pressure, meaning that if we aren't pumping the fluid into the tank, it will never get full enough to actually activate the valve, making it useless. When I was talking earlier about the top-up valves, the issue is that the top-up valve only lets fluid through if the outputs are at under 50% pressure, but due to the tier 1 pipes having a maximum of 40%, the output was always 40% or less, so the valve never actually shut. Anyway, this caustic solution does actually have a purpose besides getting rid of sodium hydroxide. When it is combined with hydrogen chloride, it makes brine, which can be voided. Now, I know I said the old plastic recipe, which by-produced hydrogen chloride, wasn't to be used anymore, but we can actually combine hydrogen and chlorine directly to make hydrogen chloride, which for now is a pretty decent way of getting rid of all this chlorine byproduct we're making. I accidentally paused my OBS and missed out on me building this steel setup to fulfill a research checkpoint, which is basically a technology where instead of doing the usual putting science packs into a lab, you instead have to produce, consume, or place enough of a specific item, in this case producing steel ingots, which is done simply by combining oxygen and iron in a foundry. The next step in this new plastic recipe is carbon monoxide. Where it diverges is the step after, alkene synthesis. By combining the carbon monoxide and hydrogen in a distillery, we get 3 different alkenes, reminiscent of advanced oil processing in vanilla. Naturally, we don't use these chemicals in the ratios they are provided to us, so we're going to need to find some way of disposing of the ones we have too much of. The first thing to do is pump them all into tanks so we can take advantage of overflow valves. Now we can burn off any excess of the 3 chemicals by combining it with oxygen in a combustion chamber. Quite usefully, the process outputs carbon dioxide as well as steam, so some of the CO2 we put into the process can be reclaimed, furthering our throughput. I think for a while about what type of turbine this should be. The correct answer is absolutely exhaust, by the way. It's not worth risking a deadlock for a paltry amount of power. Yet, I managed to land on standard. Before I start producing plastic, I remember that I'm still not actually doing anything with all that chlorine I'm producing, so I'd best get around to that, I suppose. My solution for the moment is to just turn it all into hydrogen chloride, which, as I said earlier, is okay for now, but leaves very little caustic solution for anything else, which is problematic for an important resource we will soon be getting access to. Finally, I can get around to making this plastic. By combining propene and ethylene in a flotation plant, we get polypropylene and 0 byproducts. Nice. This is, suffice to say, leagues better than what we were having to do before. We already have all the ingredients for graphite, so I shot it down in preparation for iron smelting. But Ryan, you might say, iron smelting doesn't need graphite. And you would have been right earlier, but we've unlocked a new, and more efficient, iron ingot recipe, requiring us to first crush the ore, and then combine it with graphite to get more iron for the same amount of ore, though we do still get some gravel. I get on Factory Planner and start off quite optimistic, thinking I'm going to be making 2 yellow belts of iron, but quickly realising I don't want to have a furnace stack that big, so I half the amount and realise I don't want a furnace stack that big either. The solution is quite simple. I crush a lot of sandstone into a lot of sand and stone, and turn the sand into silica, voiding the wastewater also created in the process, and then I can smelt that silica into crucibles and refactory bricks, which I can then use to make tier 2 furnaces. This mod has conditioned me to see that as quite simple. Anyway, the iron crushing process produces excess stone, so we need to separate it and we can deal with it a bit later. We then smoosh the graphite belt in between these 2 crushed iron belts, and finally I can start building the smelting stack itself. I'd like to remind you that besides the alkene and plastic production, everything I have built up to this point has been necessary to make this process work. Even despite me cutting the number of furnaces down twice, it is still very big for just a single yellow belt of throughput. Whilst I accumulate the necessary materials to build the furnaces I need, I get started on the waste disposal area. Smelting produces a lot of gravel, but I also need to handle the stone byproduct from iron ore crushing, so I end up with a 2-step process where all the stone is crushed into gravel and combined with the other byproduct gravel, where it is then all crushed down into mineral dust. We then build some flotation cells, which we can use to submerge the mineral dust in acid and turn it into sludge. The acid in question we are going to use is hydrochloric acid, which is made by combining hydrogen chloride and pure water. The process of dissolving the mineral dust also produces carbon dioxide, which we can just hook up into the base. It's not an amazing byproduct, since it's essentially free to make anyway, but it is better than nothing. Disposing of the sludge takes one final step, where we simply combine it with seawater to make wastewater, which can then be dumped into the water. I said water too many times there. Now that we're effectively getting rid of all the byproducts in this process, all that's left to do is to fill in the rest of the furnace stack. Now we can craft some more furnaces. Whilst I wait for just the last few to craft, I start planning out how to produce our next important material, aluminum. This is another one of those crafting trees I'm going to go deep into, because it is probably the most complex thing we will see in this video. Naturally, however, I get distracted before I start on it, and start working on scaling up some science. My aim is 10 science per minute, which is more than enough for the moment, as most techs cost no more than 20 science packs. Unfortunately, to build more labs, we need the 4th science pack, so for now, we're just stuck with the 1. Further distracted, I start setting up our iron component mall thing. off this new iron line. I then bring plastic over and get started for mechanical prototypes, for which I just copy the mortar and gear builds and awkwardly attach them down below. Surely now, with all that science done, we can get around to aluminum processing, right? Yes, actually. Aluminum starts out as bauxite, the yellowish material we have been using so far only for mineral samples. We crush it down into crushed bauxite, which also yields crushed iron and sand, which we just feed into their respective production areas. The next step requires caustic solution, so we're going to go back and talk about that for a moment. Caustic solution is made, as you know, by combining sodium hydroxide and saline water. Now, to produce sodium hydroxide, we use saline water electrolysis, which also produces chlorine. Up to this point, we've been using caustic solution to void this chlorine, but this ends up meaning that for every volume of caustic solution we produce, the majority of it goes to neutralising the chlorine produced by its creation. I don't quite realise the correct course of action for this yet, so I'll leave it as it is for now and end up with a crippling caustic solution shortage, though I will talk about the solution when I eventually get to it. Back at the aluminum plant, we combine the crushed bauxite with caustic solution, which gives us aluminum hydroxide and sludge. The sludge we can just send off to be turned into wastewater, but the aluminum hydroxide we then smelt into alumina, which finally smelts alongside graphite into aluminum ingots and aluminum carbide. The ingots are obviously what we want, but we still need to deal with the carbide. By combining aluminum carbide with water, we get aluminum hydroxide, which can then be fed back into the alumina production, and methane, which we mostly just store and void, but we will make some use of later. This rubber plant just sort of appeared. Assumedly, I built it when I accidentally left OBS paused, but thankfully its crafting is quite simple. All it is ethylene combined with steam to make butadiene, and then benzene and ethylene combined to make styrene, and the two are combined in a flotation plant to make the rubber. I soon start to get research queued up for a new power source, thermal solar, which is a sort of worst of both worlds between vanilla solar and nuclear. Like solar, it takes up a lot of space, and like nuclear, you have to feed it a lot of water and mess around with heat pipes and exchanges. In exchange, however, we get something we haven't been afforded so far in this run: predictable power, as despite its downsides, it is at least tied to the day-night cycle, unlike wind power, whose ebb and flow is completely random. I get a quick steel setup built to make components before moving on to the aluminum components. With it, I can get to work on these oh so cherished thermal solar panels we wanted. By combining aluminum sheets, tier 2 pipes and water, we get heat pipes, but for the panels themselves I need glass, so I bring a belt of silica down here for a little glass setup. I route it messily through the iron build, and with that we have our thermal solar panels automated, albeit slowly. I get started trying to design a little power plant to trial the new power source, but Nullius does not make it easy for me. You see, if you don't want to purify the water before you input it into the heat exchanger, every side is for a different ingredient. As for example, boiling seawater produces wastewater too. Ultimately, I just decided to purify the water first and use closed turbines, which recondense 85% of the steam back into water, to reduce the amount of water purification I needed to do. And you know what? It works. And it would work even better if I had actually connected up the second column of heat exchangers to the water, as they don't pass it through. A bit later on, however, I got an even better idea. I can boil seawater and just get rid of the wastewater that produces, and then, after passing the steam through a condenser turbine, I get pure water and a bit of power. This gives us pure water, whilst not just offsetting, but entirely reversing the power cost required. Now the problem here is obviously that if there is no power demand, then no pure water will be produced. But at the moment, we are often low on power, so it's unlikely we will run low on water, and later on when it becomes a problem, we have a way to fix it using exhaust turbines. Anyway, it's time to connect this up to the main chemical area. Up until this point, we've only been getting pure water from byproducts, so with a semi-reliable source, we will be able to expand our pure water electrolysis soon. Sick of using tier 1 pipes, I snap and automate tier 2s, which are made using plastic. Continuing the theme of strange underground belt recipes, these want gravel, which I just steal off my iron ingot production. In the midst of a crippling hydrogen shortage, and with our newfound pure water source, I add a whole one more electrolyser to the pure water electrolysis, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the kind of expansion I need to be committing to. I realise this soon enough and expand the plant to have another 4 electrolysers. The cause of this massive shortage is graphite, which between increased iron production and the introduction of aluminium is now spread very thin and needs expanding. We've spent enough time solidifying our base, and now it's time to expand it. Electrical prototypes are the next science pack, and the first of many resources we need to be producing to create it is silicon, which we're starting now. It's quite simple given what we already have, requiring just smelting silica in a furnace together with graphite. For the next step, I need to somehow get nitrogen down through this mess to where I was producing that silicon. By combining hydrogen chloride, nitrogen and silicon, we get polycrystalline silicon, as well as hydrogen and chlorine byproducts, which we can easily hook up to the existing lines. I go on a small side tangent for lubricant, which firstly needs methanol, produced by combining the methane byproduct from aluminum carbide recycling with oxygen. If we then combine the methanol with hydrogen chloride and silicon, we get hydrochloric acid and lubricant. Lubricant is going to be important because it's used in items such as red belts, train wagons, and much later on for another science pack. Back onto electrical prototypes, I brought together plastic, graphite, alumina, and aluminum sheets to make capacitors, the first primary ingredient. With just a bit of extra finagling, I bring together polycrystalline silicon, aluminum wires, graphite, and plastic to make logic circuits, the second primary ingredient. As you can see here, however, it cannot be made in a medium assembler. I need to downgrade to a small assembler to be able to produce it, for reasons? I guess it's just a finicky thing to put together and needs the delicate hands of a smaller machine. Now with these 2 on belts, I just need to get to work on the other 2, slightly simpler ingredients. An immediate issue I am facing, however, is that my aluminum production is flagging due to a lack of caustic solution, due to a lack of sodium hydroxide, due to too much chlorine, which we need caustic solution to void. It's obvious that there must be a better way, but I don't see it yet and continue in my erroneous ways. I would like to explain how ridiculous this solution is. I am electrolysing a brine produced by hydrogen chloride neutralisation, which produces exactly as much hydrogen, chlorine and sodium hydroxide as was needed to make the amount of brine it electrolyses. It is simply a waste of space and power, and I don't know why the fuck I did it. Back to the electrical prototypes again, I start automating lamps, as they are the next ingredient. You might notice that the base is, well, a bit messy, and I need to come clean to you all. I accepted the Faustian bargain, sold my soul to the spaghetti, for what I have been told, at least at this point, was pretty okay pace. As you will see later, it does not particularly pay off. The 4th and final ingredient we need is insulated wire, which is simply made by combining aluminum wire and rubber. Before I can quite get around to making the science packs themselves, I had an epiphany about how to make this water purification plant work well. I will have a primary set of standard turbines, which only activates when there is power demand, and then a secondary set of exhaust turbines, whose outputs only get added into the system when the water level is low, utilising a top-up valve on the main tank. This allows the plant to both provide power only when needed, but also still provide water if it is required when power is fine. Back at science production, I lay down the assemblers which will be making our electrical prototypes. Despite how small production is, all ingredients being created in a single building each, this is enough for 10 science per minute, which will be more than enough for the foreseeable future. Probably the most important thing in this science pack is robots and logistics, so we will be able to create a bot mall and stop needing to handcraft everything. I get the packs connected to the labs, and all that is left now is to pick where to start. I pick some techs which sound useful, but obviously at this point, my big goal is to get bots, so I keep that in mind with every technology I pick. I set that lubricant I automated earlier to use, creating train wagons, which we will use to make a locomotive, which is an ingredient in a car. one of the new and useful items unlocked by Purple Science. The crafting recipe for a car is strange, but makes sense. You even need to provide the air to inflate the tyres, and the lamps to act as headlights. Cars take canisters containing a mix of hydrogen and oxygen as fuel, and spit out water canisters when consumed, which can be emptied and then filled back up with the oxygen and hydrogen. I go for a big explorer in my car whilst research slowly trudges along. What I really need to find is iron, since my starting patch will be running low soon, and there isn't any at all in the local area. Back at the factory, I devise a devious plan to get rid of some of the chlorine which has been pulling down my caustic solution reserves, by turning it into plastic. This recipe is bad, don't get me wrong, but there is still the main plastic production which can catch up if it's too slow, and any chlorine you can get rid of is a big plus. My next part of call is to completely eviscerate saline water electrolysis from the face of the earth. Rather than electrolyse saline water directly, we first distill it into pure water and brine, before electrolysing both of them separately. At the time, I didn't know if this was any better than what I was doing before, and I still don't, but it at least cuts down on the amount of electricity we were wasting making oxygen just to vent it, as brine electrolysis produces none. Finally, the research which allows me to build more labs finishes, so I expand my science setup a little bit more. Unfortunately, it won't quite speed things up, as we are low on electrical prototypes due to an aluminum shortage, due to the ongoing caustic solution crisis. I come back the next day and realise my current power infrastructure is woefully insufficient, so I get to work on the mother of all thermal solar builds. I don't bother trying to glean any pure water from this, lest I accidentally kill power by backing up pure water. It provides 32 megawatts of power, and if I expand its solar field large enough, it will be able to run overnight on just the heat stored in the panels. It is by all means a behemoth. Next up, I automate train tracks, which we will use later on for, well, trains. The recipe is not actually too far removed from vanilla, taking gravel rather than stone, steel rods rather than iron, and with the added ingredient of plastic. Then I automated train wagons, which take a smorgasbord of different ingredients from lubricant to steel chests to all manner of steel components. Returning yet again to try to solve my caustic solution issue, I found that there is a slightly more efficient recipe, sodium hydroxide wise, and all I need to do is swap the saline water with the abundant pure water I have. It's not a massive upgrade, but I'll take anything at this point. Before I can get around 20 more new stuff, I need to expand steel, as the demand from the wagons has completely flatlined the tiny production I'd build. I end up with this pretty compact setup, all thanks to Bob's inserters, although if I really wanted to, I could have gotten the input belts and the inserters into the same row too. Thanks to all of the extra steel, I can start producing an important ingredient in higher tier buildings, mortar 2s. Since for the moment it's literally only used in buildings, and not even in massive quantities, I make only the one assembler, though I do leave room to add more later. With electrical prototypes, I unlocked Chassis 2, which is this mod's equivalent of power armour. With it of course comes a bigger equipment grid to which I had a lot of fabrication tools, increasing my handcrafting speed and therefore probably saving a couple hours of my life. At this point I unlocked compressors, which allow you to compress gases when power demand is satisfied, and then when it's in a deficit, decompress it through a turbine to release the stored energy. Similar to the earlier electrolysis based power storage, I found no use for this, as we are not far from an incredibly overpowered source of power. More on that later. Finally, I figure out how to solve our caustic solution crisis. As I mentioned earlier, most of the caustic solution we then use to get rid of the chlorine we make producing the caustic solution. My solution is to use up that chlorine elsewhere to widen our caustic solution margin. The key lies in limestone. You see, we can crush limestone down entirely into mineral dust with no byproduct, and if we then dissolve this mineral dust in hydrochloric acid, we essentially have a way to freely void chlorine. I control this belt so that mineral dust is only let in if we have more than 10,000 hydrochloric acid, as well as prioritising the mineral dust from the smelting byproducts to make sure we don't jeopardise any existing production chains. I also come to understand that my carbon dioxide production is woefully insufficient, so it's time to put together a proper build for it. In retrospect, I think I probably jumped the shark here, from woefully insufficient to extravagantly overbuilt. This can be best seen in the ridiculous amount of nitrogen voiding I'm having to do here, whilst the system slowly fills up. I've unlocked tier 2 electrolyzers, so in an effort to improve my hydrogen throughput, I've upgraded a couple of pure water electrolyzers. I also begin to scrounge together some ingredients tangential to purple science production for the next important intermediate, sensors. These are used in a multitude of items, from robots to train signals, so I want to get them out of the way sooner rather than later. It truly was a mistake for the mod author to provide me with both these small assemblers and Bob's inserters, as there truly is nothing left stopping me from making ugly little disgusting spaghetti messes like this. There are a lot of researches between me and robot logistics still, and truthfully, it's a massive pain to keep track of which ones are required and which aren't, so I decided to download the Ultimate Research Queue mod to do the thinking for me. All I do now is select the robot logistics tech, called Distribution 1 in this mod, and all of the necessary prerequisites will be queued, as well as giving me a rough ETA for when the research will be done. It settles at about 6 hours, though I have plenty of things I can do to speed that up in the meantime. First and foremost of which is just straight up increasing the production of every science. For electrical prototypes, I simply use small assembler 2s rather than 1s, before also doing this for mechanical prototypes. This won't immediately increase science production, as I haven't scaled up the ingredients, but now I can easily see what needs to be increased and build accordingly. The ETA on distribution temporarily drops down to 4, then 3 hours, but where it'll settle after the factory is allowed to run for a while is anyone's guess. Already, this extra production is straining the pure water supply, so I decided to build another one of those solar water purifiers. Rather than building it as far as I possibly could from the pure water electrolysis like last time, I instead put it in a much more logical place, just above the carbon dioxide build from a moment ago. You could have had a satisfying time lapse of it being built, but I instead decided to open the research screen like a lobotomite, so you'll have to forgive me. On the plus side, it appears the research ETA has held strong so far. Even with tier 2 crushers and haste modules, which are a sort of worse version of speed modules this mod adds, we aren't crushing enough limestone to void a satisfactory amount of chlorine, so I'm going to need to go bigger than this shitty little thing. I end up with this big fella, which should by all means be able to keep up with our demands for the foreseeable future. Another important resource which is now flagging is iron, due to us slowly but surely sucking the starter patch dry. Thankfully, there is a decently sized patch not a ridiculous distance away, which we can tap with our new medium miner 2s. That's right, after only 18 hours, we have miners as good as the basic electric ones you get in vanilla. I even get to set them out in a way which seems to infuriate everyone in the comments of my other videos. I also got beacons researched. Yeah, they come quite early in this mod, and my first part of call with them is these alumina furnaces, which I appear to have severely underbuilt earlier on. To get to the distribution tech, I have to yet again complete a checkpoint technology, this time being freshwater utilisation. I wasn't aware at the time, but freshwater is kind of a big deal, as due to being pumped up from the ground rather than from the sea, it has no salt in it, so it is only a single step in the hydro plant away from pure water. Needless to say, this would significantly improve our pure water situation if I were to realise this, but for now, it is relegated to this singular pair of underground pumps and a hydro plant. In preparation for the distribution tech, which should only be a little over an hour away now, I make these passive provider chests at the end of this little bus, fed by loaders, so they will be available to the bot mall. The holes in production created by increasing science production are starting to show by this point, so I'm constantly running around upgrading buildings or adding modules and beacons to make sure the base can sustain the current rate of research. Surprisingly at this point, the slowest science packs are the two basic ones, so they are now my focus. The fact is that these simple recipes are only designed to be used right in the beginning of the game, and there are some much more complicated, but much more efficient recipes which we are closing in on. The fact is that with a recipe this cheap and simple, even if it is slow, it's always going to be easier to just expand the shitty production than make a more complicated but smaller one. For the moment, I just shot down some more beacons and modules, but this is clearly not sustainable. If you were curious by now just how many of each building I had in this base, so was I, and I made a blueprint of the entire thing to check. Over 1,000 normal and underground pipes is quite a lot, but if I'm honest, I think the most interesting thing here is just that proper overview of the base, which goes to show quite how much of a mess it is. As if this mess wasn't bad enough already, I realise I can squeeze a haste module assembly into the sensor mess, which will make my life a bit easier as previously I was hand feeding an assembler to make them. As part of my further preparation for a bot mall, I make buffers for logic circuits and capacitors, which I will later turn into passive provider chests, as they are used in a lot of the more advanced buildings as well as in bots themselves. With distribution close on the horizon, I need to pick my next technology to target, and that ends up being geothermal power. Do you remember that really good power source I was talking about earlier? This is it. I'll talk more about why that is when I actually get to them. After deciding on where I was going to put the bot mall, I placed down all the roboports, or hangars as the mod likes to call them, to give me one less thing to do later. As well as that, I give all the metal intermediate area robot coverage, so I can connect the output chests to the mall too. Finally, the research finishes, and we are opened up into a new era of play. Immediately, I get to work on automating the most essential things. More robots, and more logistic chests. The chests are relatively simple, just a steel chest, an arithmetic combinator, and an antenna. But the bots are of course going to take a few more steps. At the moment, we are at the base of an exponential curve. Crafting is slow, but as more bots are slowly crafted, the whole process will speed up, which will mean more bots, which will mean more speed, which will mean more bots, which will mean more speed, which will mean more bots. You get the idea. If I was going to pin down the point where this run went into decline, this would be it. Now that I had my bot mall put together, my next logical thought was that now was the time for a train base. This is almost always the correct choice, but little did I know in this mod that I was on the cusp of something which would have made my life significantly easier if I had pursued it. Something else which will make my life easier is that I'm finally making use of these fumaroles. Using an extractor, I can gather volcanic gas, which is immediately fulfilling a research checkpoint, but is also useful for an improved climate sample recipe. The recipe requires volcanic gas, nitrogen and wastewater, and produces climate samples much faster than the initial recipe we were using. The best thing about it, you might notice, is that besides volcanic gas, the ingredients are all byproducts we were avoiding anyway. Whilst routing the sample over, we have a minor sodium hydroxide spillage. Another research checkpoint I need to fulfill is concrete, so I horrendously bootstrap it just to fulfill the requirement. This is a bit of a mistake. You see, the mod author is a smart guy, and these checkpoints exist for a reason. Just as the volcanic gas checkpoint was to nudge you towards the climate sample recipe, this was intended to clue you in for the next science pack, for which one of its ingredients is concrete. It would have paid back in spades for me to have automated it properly now, so I implore you, when you play this mod, if the mod author makes you do something, take a step back and think about why. In other news, geothermal power has just finished researching, so I'm pretty giddy about that, and get started trying to make a power plant. The upfront cost is humongous, but once the plant is placed and operational, it will output the power constantly, forever, and with zero maintenance. I consider momentarily using heat exchangers and turbines, but we actually unlocked a new type of turbine, a Stirling engine, which makes power from nothing but heat. The idea is similar, a massive upfront cost, but once created, it needs no water, only heat coming in and power going out. I built the setup over here near the prototype compression battery, as it needs compressed nitrogen to craft. I decided that my robot's exponential growth needed a little linear boost, so I fill up my crafting queue with logistics robots and go for a long drive to pass the time, and hopefully find some useful resources. More than ever at this point, our base needs a serious power boost. I've started producing the recently researched wind turbine tier 2s in the mall, but progress is slow and they are still just as unreliable as their younger sibling. Geothermal power could not come sooner, but we're still waiting on Stirling engines. A pretty cool thing this mod adds, which is useful for high robot traffic areas like this, is chargers. They are basically just really cheap robo parts, and all they do is charge, not providing any construction area or logistics. The mod also adds the opposite, buildings which provide the areas but do not charge, though I don't see as much usefulness in these. By filling up a canister with methanol, benzene and oxygen, we get a methanol canister, which is like one of those hydrogen canisters from earlier, but better in every way. Among its many uses is as a fuel for the new piece of equipment we just unlocked, the jetpack. Yep, moving around this Gordian knot of a base has just gotten a bit easier. Pipe Visualizer absolutely shines with a mod like this. By this point, I've finally crafted enough Stirling engines to make use of this geothermal plant I crafted. It could not be easier. Simply place the plant down on the fumarole, place down 10 Stirling engines, connect them all with heat pipes, and just like that, you have 8 megawatts of power forever, once it's heated up of course. It's worth noting that the plant itself says it produces 10 megawatts of heat, but the Stirling engines only operate at 80% of efficiency, so we only get 80% of that. I get chlorine barreling set up, which is an ingredient in the new improvised explosives we just unlocked. They're basically cliff explosives, but you have to handcraft them. It's mostly a stopgap solution prior to the proper recipe, which isn't unlocked until the next science pack. You're going to recall that I said the run was starting to go into a decline earlier. Well, this is the point where it enters freefall. This train system I'm starting here was the biggest mistake of the run so far, and is responsible for hours of wasted time. And if I had just taken a step back and went for the next science pack, this video would have ended in a very different place. Consequently, I'm not going to go into detail on it. I'll show you the pretty builds, but it's all going to be obsolete once we have the next science pack. Chemical research. For example, these electrolysis plants are nice and make use of that new and quirky freshwater purification, but if I had waited and instead done steam electrolysis, I would be directly producing compressed hydrogen and oxygen, which can be much more effectively transported as they are 3 times denser. There's nothing wrong with this air separation build per se, but again, I could be compressing this gas, which would make transportation by train far more efficient. The graphite build is okay, but there is a much better graphite production process in chemical science called methane pyrolysis. Also, this build is bottlenecked by waiting for the trains to bring carbon monoxide over from literally next door. If I was building smartly, I would have instead made it into a single factory which turns carbon dioxide and hydrogen straight into graphene, instead of breaking it into 2 factories. An actual smart thing I did with this setup though, is electrolysing the byproduct water and feeding the hydrogen back into the system to make it last a bit longer. For my chlorine and sodium hydroxide needs, I just go for saline electrolysis. Even if brine electrolysis might have been a bit more effective, power is no object now, as I've been slowly taking over every fumarole in a known world with my geothermal power plants. Yet again, you can see I designed it to be repeatable, and as is almost a theme in this video, I will never build another one. Here's what consolidating one of those fumarole fields looks like. It can be hard getting all 10 around the plant for some in the middle, but you can't really complain when it's free power forever. I'll let past me explain this bit. Good job we didn't miss much, yeah? This is basically just a scaled up version of the waste management area in the old base. Not a massive amount to say about it really. Limestone crushing included to get rid of all that excess chlorine from saline electrolysis. One thing I did do right with this base is that I avoid 0 chlorine using caustic solution, so I have more than I could ever need for when we get to aluminum processing. It is iron processing o'clock over here, and oh boy is it ugly. I have no idea what I was thinking of that pickup station. Certainly isn't expandable. Like everything else in this base, we get a much better iron ingot recipe later. I swear, the base roast is almost over. There is only a few more things worth showing before I realised my foolishness. Plastic production just uses the alkene synthesis path, and this is almost the most egregious ever, as chemical science gives us not 1, but 2 new plastic recipes, both of which are leagues beyond this one. I think it was somewhere in the process of building this aluminum build, I realised I had taken a misstep somewhere. You see, Literally one of the first technologies you research with chemical science is an improved aluminum recipe, which gives you way more ingots for the same amount of ore. So yeah, I'm going to come clean now. This entire last bit where I was showing you all the train base and how it could and should have been better, that's all just a glorified advert, because I want you to watch the next one, which is where I'm actually going to implement all of the cool stuff I was talking about. Before I do finish though, I should probably make a small chemical science build, so I can start chugging away through all these new fancy technologies. All that was missed when I forgot to record was me setting up concrete, and I put it onto a belt with sodium hydroxide here, which makes up our first two ingredients for chemical science. Then by combining compressed hydrogen and compressed nitrogen, we get ammonia, which we barrel up, giving us our third ingredient. Glass is our fourth ingredient, which I need to try and squeeze through this mess. We can then separate volcanic gas into carbon dioxide, air, and most importantly, sulfur dioxide, which we can combine with water to make sulfuric acid, our fifth ingredient. The final ingredient is a lubricant, and with that, we have our chemistry research packs. God, I should have done this about 10 hours ago. I can then hook them into the science build, and then I immediately queue up packaging, which is a really cool technology you're gonna have to wait until next time to see me use. That's right, at a light 40 hours into the run, I'm calling it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time. A super special thanks to my Ko-Fi supporters for supporting me, and allowing me to make longer videos like these. As always, they are Dragonium, Zachahaquak, Acrid Arsonist, Arome, Nathan14321, Dictastily Enthusiast, Scovey, Watcher, Mockafet, Greenest God, Caspaint, Foxtrot 9000, Moonrunes, Shrunk Hoovy, Dr. Ducklumps, Das Tom, Leo, The Fiendish, Sukares, Pro Moron, Justice, Michael Schoening, Hey1121, and Ion Burger.